A 6-year-old walked miles through a deadly blizzard to knock on a mafia boss's gate at dawn, whispering 5 words that would shatter his frozen heart. "Sir, my mom didn't return last night." Vincent Russo, the most feared man in the city, had 12 minutes to find Nina Patterson locked in his own casino's break room, burning with fever and dying alone, before the daughter waiting in his mansion lost the only family she had left. What he didn't know was that saving them both would force him to choose between the empire he'd built on blood and the family he never knew he was starving for. No one approached Vincent Russo's gates without an invitation written in blood or stamped with authority that could end careers. The mansion on the hill stood like a judgment over the city below, its lights cold and distant, its walls thick enough to muffle screams. The guards who patrolled the perimeter knew better than to disturb their boss for anything less than war, their breath-forming clouds as thick as the snow blanketing the frozen ground beneath their boots. But this sound, this desperate tapping against metal, made Glenn Archer reach for his radio with hands that suddenly felt uncertain. Inside, Vincent woke from dreams that had stopped being peaceful years ago, his instincts sharper than any alarm system money could buy, recognizing threat before his mind could name it. The knock repeated, weaker this time, almost lost to the wind that rattled windows and shook the bare branches of trees like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. He moved through darkened hallways where portraits of stern-faced men watched with painted eyes. His father, his grandfather, the ghosts who'd built this empire on violence and will. The marble floor bit cold through his bare feet, but he'd stopped feeling discomfort decades ago. Stopped feeling most things except the weight of power and the emptiness it left behind. Jackson Cole appeared at the top of the stairs, his face carved from stone. But something flickered in his eyes, confusion that bordered on alarm. "Sir," he said, each word careful, measured. "There's a child at the gate, alone in this storm. She's asking for you." Something in those words struck like a match in a room full of gasoline. Unexpected, dangerous, impossible to ignore. He descended the stairs without responding, pulling on the black coat that hung by the door like a second skin, its weight familiar as his own heartbeat. What Vincent would find at those gates would crack open a heart he'd sealed shut 5 years ago, and there was no going back from what came next. The cold hit him the moment he stepped outside, a wall of white and wind that stole breath and buried the world under layers of frozen silence. His boots crunched through snow already 6 inches deep, the sound lost immediately to the storm's roar. Through the ornate bars of the gate, he saw her. A shape so small it seemed impossible she'd survive the walk up the hill. Her blue coat was thin as paper, her blonde curls crusted with ice crystals that caught what little light the dawn provided through the churning clouds above. A worn red backpack hung from one shoulder, dusted white with snow. She looked up when his shadow fell across her, and for a moment the wind seemed to pause, the world holding its breath. Her lips were blue, her small hands clutched around the bars with fingers that had gone white at the knuckles from cold and determination mixed in equal measure. "Sir," she whispered, and her voice was barely human, rasped raw by cold and crying. "My mom didn't come home last night." The words hung between them like a confession, like a prayer offered to the last person who should hear it. He'd heard pleas before, thousands of them, each one blending into the next until they became white noise against the soundtrack of his empire. But this wasn't a plea. This was a fact delivered by someone too young to understand that facts could be more dangerous than lies. The choice Vincent made in the next 30 seconds would either save 2 lives or condemn them both. And somewhere across the city, the clock was already ticking down. The guards waited for his signal, for the dismissal that would send her back down the hill into the storm. Instead, he reached for the gate himself, his hands that had signed death warrants and broken unbreakable men, working the lock with fingers that suddenly felt clumsy, uncertain. The gate swung open with a groan of metal on metal, and she stumbled forward, her legs barely holding her upright. He caught her before she fell, and the weight of her was nothing, less than nothing, a bundle of frozen cloth and fragile bones that trembled like a bird's. "How long have you been walking?" he asked, and his voice came out different than intended, stripped of the edge that usually made subordinates flinch. She didn't answer, couldn't answer, her teeth chattering so violently that words became impossible between the shivers racking her tiny frame. He lifted her without thinking, cradling her against his chest where his coat could shield her from wind that wanted to tear her away. Her head fell against his shoulder, and through the layers of fabric he could feel how cold she'd become, how close to something irreversible. The walk back to the house seemed longer than it had moments before. Each step deliberate, careful not to jostle her too roughly. Behind them, the gate clanged shut, sealing them inside walls that had never been meant for children, for innocence, for tiny frozen fingers that gripped his coat like it was the only solid thing left in a dissolving world. Inside, warmth hit like a physical force. But she didn't stop shivering, the cold too deep to be chased away by heated air alone. He carried her past startled staff who pressed themselves against walls, past rooms filled with expensive silence, straight to the library where a fireplace stretched from floor to ceiling like a mouth waiting to devour the cold. Hello. If this story touches your heart even a little, go ahead and subscribe. Join our family of hope and love, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Let's share this journey together. He set her down on the leather sofa nearest the flames, and for the first time in years, found himself uncertain of what to do next. His hands hovering uselessly as she curled into herself, still shaking, still silent except for the desperate chatter of her teeth against the storm raging in her small body. Dorothy Sullivan appeared in the doorway with blankets before he could call for them, her maternal instincts overriding years of training that said, never enter a room without permission. She wrapped the child in layers of wool and cashmere, her weathered hands efficient but gentle, clucking softly like she was handling injured wildlife rather than a human being who'd somehow survived the mountain in winter darkness. He stepped back, watching the flames catch and dance across wood that crackled and hissed, sending shadows across walls lined with books nobody read anymore. The child's breathing began to even out, the violent tremors gradually subsiding into occasional shivers that rippled through the blankets, cocooning her like aftershocks following an earthquake. "Hot chocolate," Dorothy whispered, already moving toward the door. "And soup. The child needs—" But he raised one hand, stopping her mid-sentence, his eyes never leaving the small face that was slowly regaining color, pink creeping back into cheeks that had been gray as ash. When they were alone, he pulled a chair close to the sofa, sitting forward with his elbows on his knees, studying her the way he'd learned to study everything, looking for cracks, weaknesses, the truth hiding beneath whatever story was about to emerge. She watched him back, her eyes huge and dark, still glassy with cold but sharpening now, awareness returning like dawn breaking over frozen ground. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice low, unthreatening, the tone he'd perfected for negotiations that required patience rather than pressure. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again, her voice coming out scratchy and small, barely louder than the fire's whisper. "Lily," she said, and the name hung between them, delicate as the flower it represented, out of place in this room where deals were made and empires were carved from other men's failures. She pulled the blankets tighter, her small fingers knotting in the fabric like she was afraid someone would take them away. "Lily," he repeated, tasting the word, finding it strange on his tongue. "You said your mother didn't come home. Where does she work?" The question was gentle, but beneath it lay the machinery of his mind already turning, already calculating possibilities, already preparing for whatever truth was coming. What Lily said next would send Vincent racing against a clock he didn't know had already started. And miles away, in a locked room he owned, her mother had less than an hour left. She shifted under the blankets, sitting up straighter, and he could see her gathering courage the way children do, all at once in a rush before fear could stop them. "At the Royal Diamond," she said, the words tumbling out faster now. "She works at the bar. She's always home by midnight, always. But last night she didn't come back." The name of the establishment hit him like ice water. Recognition sharp and immediate. The Royal Diamond sat on the edge of his territory. A casino that wore respectability like a mask, but bled money from card games and private rooms where limits didn't exist for those who could afford to lose them. He owned it through 3 shell companies and a chain of managers who knew better to bother him with operational details. "She serves drinks," Lily continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, as if saying it out loud made it more real, more urgent. "Sometimes she doesn't finish until really late. But she always calls, always. She has a phone at the bar, and she calls me before she leaves, every single night, so I know she's coming." He watched her face as she spoke, seeing the fear there, but also something else. A fierce certainty that her mother wouldn't abandon her, that something must have happened, that the world wouldn't simply swallow someone and leave no trace behind. It was the kind of faith that didn't exist in his world, where loyalty was bought and trust was a liability that got people killed. "Last night the phone didn't ring," she whispered, and her eyes filled with tears that didn't fall, held back by sheer will. "I waited and waited. I fell asleep on the couch by the phone. When I woke up, it was still dark, and she wasn't there, and the apartment was so cold because we ran out of oil for the heater." The details painted a picture he didn't want to see. The small apartment, the single mother stretching every dollar until it screamed, the child waiting by a silent phone while snow buried the city outside. It was a reality that existed in the same world as his mansion, but they occupied different universes, never meant to intersect. "So you walked here?" he said, not quite a question, still trying to understand the logic that would send a 6-year-old into a blizzard toward the one place in the city where innocence went to die. She nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand, a gesture so childlike it seemed impossible she'd just survived something that would have killed grown men. "Mrs. Baumel, Brennan next door said you're the boss of everything," Lily explained, her voice matter of fact, as if discussing the weather rather than the criminal empire that made politicians nervous and rival families disappear. "She said if someone's missing, you're the only one who can find them. She said you're scary, but you're fair." Fair. The word echoed in his mind like a joke, like something from another life before he'd learned that fairness was a luxury for people who didn't understand how the world actually worked. But what Vincent didn't realize was that the system designed to protect Nina had already failed her. And in 12 minutes, he would discover exactly how unfair his world truly was. But in this child's eyes, he saw belief. The kind that couldn't be faked or bought. That existed because someone had told her it was true, and she'd had no reason yet to learn about lies. Dorothy returned with a tray, setting it on the low table with practiced silence. Steam rose from a mug of chocolate topped with melting marshmallows, and beside it sat a bowl of soup that filled the room with the smell of chicken and herbs, comfort distilled into liquid warmth. Lily's eyes fixed on the food with an intensity that spoke of more than just the morning's ordeal, and he realized with cold certainty that breakfast wasn't guaranteed in her world, that the hunger in her gaze came from a place deeper than one missed meal. She looked at him, asking permission without words, and he nodded, watching as she reached for the mug with both hands, holding it like it contained something precious and rare. Vincent stood, his decision forming even before he fully understood it. "I'll find her," he said, and the promise felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown air. Lily looked up at him, chocolate on her upper lip, hope blazing so bright in her eyes it hurt to witness. "You promise?" she whispered. And Vincent Russo, who'd built an empire on violence, who'd learned never to make promises he might not keep, who'd convinced himself years ago that caring about anyone was the fastest way to die, heard himself say with absolute certainty, "I promise." Vincent left Lily by the fire with Dorothy hovering protectively, the housekeeper already moving toward the kitchen with purpose that suggested she'd feed this child until color returned permanently to those too pale cheeks. He retreated to his office, the door closing with a soft click that felt like sealing himself away from something he didn't yet understand. His phone sat on the desk, sleek and black, a weapon he'd wielded 1,000 times to bend reality to his will. He picked it up, scrolling through contacts until he found Howard Blake's name. The casino manager answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep and immediately sharpening with fear when he recognized the caller. "Mr. Russo, sir, You have a bartender named Nina Patterson," Vincent interrupted, his voice stripped of everything except cold precision. "She didn't go home last night after her shift. Tell me where she is." Silence stretched for 3 heartbeats too long. "Sir, We closed at 4. The cleaning crew finished by 5. "Everyone left? Then you didn't check thoroughly enough." Each word landed like a blade. "She's somewhere in that building. Find her. You have 15 minutes to call me back with her location, or you're going to wish you'd checked more carefully." He ended the call before Blake could stammer more excuses, setting the phone down with controlled care that barely masked the tension coiling through his shoulders. What Blake would find in that locked break room would expose the fatal flaw in Vincent's empire. The same system that built his fortune had just tried to kill an innocent woman, and Vincent was about to burn it all down to save her. Through the office door, he could hear Dorothy's soft voice, the clink of a spoon against ceramic, Lily's small responses growing stronger as warmth and hot chocolate worked their magic. The sounds felt foreign in this house, like music in a language he'd forgotten how to speak. Vincent stood at the window, watching dawn struggle to break through clouds that promised more snow. The city sprawled below, still sleeping, unaware that somewhere in its frozen streets a woman might be dying while her daughter sat in his library believing he could fix everything. The weight of that faith pressed against his chest like a physical force. His phone rang in 11 minutes. "We found her!" Blake gasped, and Vincent could hear running footsteps, voices shouting in the background. "Staff break room, back of the building. Door was locked from the outside. The night supervisor didn't check it. Jesus Christ, Mr. Russo, she's unconscious. She's burning up. I'm calling an ambulance." "Don't!" The command cut through Blake's panic like a knife through silk. "I'm coming myself. Keep her warm. Don't move her. Don't let anyone near her except to keep her stable. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir, but she needs a hospital." "I'll take her to the hospital." Vincent was already moving, grabbing his coat from where he'd hung it barely 20 minutes ago, its fabric still damp from the blizzard. "You focus on figuring out how one of your employees almost died on my property because your staff is incompetent." He hung up and found Dorothy in the hallway, her expression questioning. "The child's mother?" she asked quietly. "Found her. She's alive. Barely." He pulled on his coat, the weight of it settling like armor. "Keep Lily here. Keep her warm. Keep her safe. Tell her I'm bringing her mother back." Dorothy's eyes softened with something that might have been approval or might have been surprise. "You're a good man, Mr. Russo." The words felt like an accusation. "No," he said flatly. "I'm just the only one who can fix this." But as Vincent raced toward the Royal Diamond, he had no idea that saving Nina would crack open the frozen shell he'd built around his heart. And once it started breaking, there would be no stopping it. But as he walked back toward the library to tell Lily he was keeping his promise, As he saw her small face light up with hope so pure it hurt to witness, Vincent wondered if maybe Dorothy was right. Maybe he was more than the sum of his sins. Maybe redemption looked like a 6-year-old in a blue coat, asking impossible things from impossible men. The blizzard had softened to steady snowfall, but the roads were treacherous, buried under drifts that turned familiar streets into white labyrinths. Vincent drove with the same controlled aggression that governed everything he did, the SUV's engine growling through the storm like a predator hunting prey. The Royal Diamond announced itself through the gray morning with neon signs dark and lifeless, the building's facade wearing its emptiness like shame. He parked directly in front of the entrance, ignoring every parking regulation, and strode toward doors that should have been locked but opened at his touch. Inside, the casino floor stretched out in silent judgment, slot machines dormant, card tables covered, the smell of stale cigarettes and desperation lingering in air that hadn't fully cleared from the night before. Howard Blake materialized from the back offices, his face pale and slick with sweat despite the building's chill. "Mr. Russo, I'm so sorry, the night supervisor." "Where is she?" Blake led him through the main floor toward the employee areas, talking too fast, his words tripping over themselves in their urgency to explain the inexplicable. "The break room door sticks sometimes. The lock catches. The night supervisor is new, he didn't know to check. He thought everyone had gone home." Vincent stopped listening. What Vincent was about to see in that break room would haunt him for the rest of his life. Nina Patterson had been left to die in a room he owned, forgotten by a system that valued profit over people. This was the cost of his empire. The break room was small and windowless, the kind of space that existed purely for function rather than comfort. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across furniture that had seen better decades. Nina Patterson lay on a sagging couch against the far wall, her body curled into itself, one arm hanging off the cushion toward the floor. Someone had thrown a jacket over her, but it had slipped down, inadequate against the cold that had seeped into the room through walls that were never meant to retain heat overnight. Vincent crossed the space in 3 strides, dropping to one knee beside the couch. Her face was flushed with fever, her skin radiating heat even from inches away. Dark circles shadowed her closed eyes, and her breathing came shallow and rapid, each exhale a small sound of distress. He touched her forehead, and the heat of her burned against his palm. "Nina," he said, keeping his voice low, gentle in a way he barely remembered how to be. "Nina, can you hear me?" Her eyes flickered but didn't open. Her lips moved, forming words without sound. He leaned closer. "Lily," she whispered, the name barely audible, cracking in her throat. "Have to get home. She's waiting. She's alone." The words hit him like a fist to the chest. "She's not alone," he said, though he doubted Nina could hear him through the fever's fog. "She came to me. She's safe. I'm taking you to her." He slid one arm beneath her shoulders, the other under her knees, lifting her with the same careful precision he'd used to carry her daughter hours earlier. Nina's head lolled against his shoulder, and through the layers of his coat he could feel how her body trembled. Not from cold now, but from whatever illness had been burning through her system for God knew how long. Vincent didn't know it yet, but carrying Nina Patterson out of that locked room was the moment everything changed. The fortress he'd built around his heart was already crumbling, and there was no going back. Blake hovered in the doorway, his hands twisting together uselessly. "Sir, I'll call the best ambulance service. I'll make sure they know it's your—" "I'm taking her myself." Vincent adjusted his grip, securing Nina more firmly against his chest. "And Blake, you're going to spend the rest of today figuring out how this happened. How one of my employees collapsed on my property and no one noticed for 8 hours. How a mother almost died because your staff couldn't be bothered to check a locked door. Blake's face went from pale to gray. Yes, sir. Of course, sir. I'll have a full report. I don't want a report. I want to make sure it never happens again. Vincent carried Nina through the casino, past Blake's stammering apologies, out into the snow that had gentled to soft flurries drifting down like ash. He settled her in the back seat of the SUV, removing his coat to cover her, adjusting the heat until warm air blasted from every vent. The drive to Mercy General took 18 minutes that felt like hours. The emergency room at Dawn existed in its own universe, fluorescent bright and antiseptic clean, a space where time moved differently, measured in heartbeats and monitor beeps rather than minutes on a clock. Vincent carried Nina through sliding doors that whooshed open like a mouth swallowing them whole, and the triage nurse looked up from her computer screen with an expression that cycled through surprise, recognition, and professional neutrality in 3 rapid heartbeats. She needs help, he said, the words coming out rougher than intended. High fever, unconscious for at least 8 hours, possible hypothermia. The nurse was already moving, calling for an orderly, for a gurney, her hands reaching to check Nina's pulse even as Vincent stood there holding her. How long has she been like this? I don't know. She didn't go home after her shift last night. I found her 20 minutes ago. A gurney appeared, pushed by 2 orderlies who moved with practiced efficiency, and Vincent found himself reluctant to let go, his arms tightening reflexively around Nina's slight frame. Sir, the nurse said gently, we need to take her now. He lowered Nina onto the thin mattress, watching as they secured straps and began wheeling her toward double doors marked staff only. She didn't stir, didn't react, and the sight of her complete stillness sent something cold through his chest. Wait, he said, and the orderlies paused. He looked at the nurse. She has a daughter, 6 years old. The girl's waiting for her mother. She needs to know. We'll do everything we can. The nurse interrupted, her voice kind but firm. But right now, we need to get her stable. They disappeared through the doors, taking Nina into that space where Vincent's power and influence meant nothing, where doctors and nurses fought battles he couldn't control with money or threats or the weight of his name. For the first time in decades, Vincent Russo was completely helpless. And in that helplessness, something inside him began to crack, the ice around his heart melting 1 painful degree at a time. He stood in the middle of the emergency room, surrounded by other people's crises, and for the first time in decades felt completely helpless. Dr. Yasmin Foster found him 40 minutes later, still standing in nearly the same spot, his coat forgotten on a plastic chair, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Mr. Russo? She approached with the confidence of someone who'd delivered both miracles and death sentences, her dark eyes sharp with assessment. I'm Dr. Foster. You brought in Nina Patterson? How is she? Stable. For now. The doctor gestured toward a quieter corner, away from the waiting area's chaos. She has severe influenza complicated by exhaustion and dehydration. Her body temperature when she came in was 94 degrees, not quite hypothermia, but close. Another few hours without treatment. She let the sentence trail off, the implication clear. Vincent's jaw tightened. But she'll recover? With proper care, yes. We're giving her IV fluids, antibiotics for potential secondary infection, medication to bring down the fever. She'll need to stay here at least 48 hours for monitoring. Dr. Foster paused, studying him with open curiosity. The nurse said you found her? That she's your employee? She works at one of my properties, Vincent said carefully, offering truth without detail. She has a daughter who needs her. That's all that matters. Something shifted in the doctor's expression. Respect, maybe, or surprise that someone like him would speak of a bartender with such careful concern. The daughter is safe? Dr. Foster asked. She's with me, at my home, waiting. The doctor nodded slowly. Good, because Ms. Patterson's been asking for her. She's delirious, disoriented, but she keeps saying the name Lily over and over. Can I see her? Dr. Foster hesitated, clearly weighing hospital policy against the reality of who was asking. 5 minutes. She's sedated but responsive. Don't upset her. What Vincent didn't know was that the conversation he was about to have with Nina would seal all three of their fates. In 5 minutes, he would make a promise that would change everything. Nina had been moved to a small room in the emergency department, curtained off from the chaos beyond. Tubes and wires connected her to machines that beeped softly, tracking the rhythms that defined survival. She looked smaller in the hospital bed, diminished by institutional white sheets and harsh lighting that showed every shadow of exhaustion carved into her face. Vincent approached quietly, stopping beside the bed where he could see her chest rising and falling with steady breaths that seemed stronger than before. Her eyes opened slowly, struggling against sedation, and focused on him with effort that seemed to cost everything she had left. "Lily," she whispered, her voice raw and broken. "My daughter. Is she—" "She's safe," Vincent said quickly, leaning closer so she wouldn't have to strain. "She came to me this morning. She's at my house. Warm and fed and waiting for you." Confusion flickered across Nina's face, followed by something that might have been fear, or might have been the last defense of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of help. Why? The single word contained volumes of questions. Vincent didn't have an answer that made sense, not even to himself. "Because she asked me to find you," he said finally. "And I keep my promises." Nina's eyes drifted closed again, exhaustion pulling her back under, but not before Vincent saw tears slip down her temples into the pillow beneath her head. "Thank you," she breathed, the words barely audible. "Please tell her. Tell her I'm okay. Tell her I'm coming home." "I will." Vincent straightened, looking down at this woman who'd almost died alone in a locked room, this stranger who'd somehow become his responsibility. "But when you're well enough, you're both coming with me, until you're strong enough to decide what happens next." He wasn't sure if she heard him, but the promise had been made anyway, binding as any contract signed in blood. The mansion transformed in ways too subtle for outsiders to notice, but profound enough that longtime staff members exchanged glances when they thought no one was watching. Nina and Lily had been in residence for 3 weeks, occupying the East Wing's guest suites that had stood empty for years. Dorothy Sullivan had overseen the preparation of the rooms with the kind of attention usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. Fresh linens daily, flowers on the nightstands, the thermostat adjusted to ensure warmth reached every corner. But while Vincent thought he was simply providing temporary shelter, something far more dangerous was happening. The fortress he'd spent 5 years building was being dismantled from the inside. One breakfast at a time. One child's laugh at a time. One moment of domestic peace at a time. But it was the small changes throughout the house that told the real story. Lily's drawings appeared on hallway walls, taped up by Dorothy, who'd asked no permission but anticipated no objection. Crude crayon representations of houses with smoke curling from chimneys, stick figure families holding hands, dogs they didn't have but she apparently wished for, each one a window into hopes that had been deferred by survival, but never quite extinguished. Vincent found himself pausing to study them during his late-night wanderings, when insomnia drove him from his bed to walk through rooms that felt different now. Less like a fortress and more like something he didn't have words for yet. The breakfast room, a space he'd used maybe twice in 5 years, now served as the morning gathering place. He'd walk in to find Lily chattering to Dorothy about dreams or birds or questions no one could possibly answer, while Nina sipped coffee with the careful slowness of someone still rebuilding strength. They'd look up when he entered, and something in the room would shift. Not tension exactly, but awareness. Recognition that the spaces they occupied weren't just rooms, but territories being unconsciously negotiated and claimed. "Good morning," Nina would say, her voice still carrying the roughness of someone who'd been too sick for too long, and Vincent would nod, taking his usual chair while Dorothy poured coffee that appeared without him asking for it. These small rituals had developed without planning or discussion, assembling themselves like puzzle pieces that fit together despite having no picture to follow. Vincent Russo was falling. Not into danger, into something far more terrifying. He was falling into the rhythm of family, and he didn't even realize it was happening. Vincent started coming home earlier. It happened gradually enough that he almost didn't notice. Meetings cut short with excuses that would have been transparent if anyone dared question them. Phone calls handled from the car instead of the office. His presence at the mansion in late afternoon becoming routine rather than exception. Jackson Cole noticed. His head of security was too observant not to. "You're home early again," Jackson said one evening, his tone carefully neutral as they reviewed security reports in Vincent's office. "The work got done," Vincent replied without looking up from the papers in front of him. "Yes, sir." A pause. "The child was asking about you earlier. Wanted to know when you'd be back." Vincent's hand stilled on the page. "What did you tell her?" "That you always come home." Jackson's expression remained impassive. "Was I wrong?" Their eyes met, and in that moment Vincent understood that his second-in-command saw everything. The changes, the softening, the way the fortress was becoming something else. "No," Vincent said finally. "You weren't wrong." That night, something would happen that Vincent couldn't take back. Something that would prove he'd already crossed a line he didn't even know existed. That night, Lily fell asleep during a movie they'd been watching together in the library. Some animated thing about toys coming to life that Dorothy had selected. Her head had gradually tipped sideways until it rested against Vincent's shoulder, her small hand curled on his arm, her breathing evening out into sleep's rhythm. Vincent sat very still, afraid that moving might wake her, might break whatever spell had made this moment possible. Across the room, Nina watched with an expression he couldn't quite read. Something between gratitude and wonder and fear, as if witnessing something precious but fragile, beautiful but temporary. "She trusts you," Nina said quietly when the movie ended and Lily still hadn't stirred. Vincent looked down at the child sleeping against him, at the complete abandon in her posture that spoke of safety so absolute she didn't need to stay alert. "She shouldn't," he said, the truth tasting bitter. "She doesn't know who I am, what I've done." "She knows enough." Nina stood, crossing to where they sat, and carefully lifted Lily into her own arms. The child made a small sound of protest but didn't wake, her head finding her mother's shoulder with the instinct of long practice. "Thank you," Nina said, and Vincent wasn't sure if she meant for letting Lily sleep or for something larger, something neither of them was ready to name. "Don't," he said roughly. "Don't thank me for this." "For what?" "For letting us into your home. For saving my life. For being someone my daughter can trust when she's been taught to trust no one." But Vincent didn't say any of that. "For doing what anyone would do," he finished lamely. Nina smiled, sad and knowing and gentle all at once. "No," she said. "Not anyone. You." She carried Lily upstairs, leaving Vincent alone in the library with the movie's credits rolling and the fire burning low. And something in his chest cracked a little more, ice melting into water, hardness giving way to something dangerously close to hope. December arrived with fresh snow and holiday decorations appearing throughout the city like commercial obligations dressed as joy. Vincent had always ignored Christmas, another marker of time passing, another reminder of things he'd lost or never had. If you felt something while watching, please subscribe. That's how I know these stories mean something to you, even on your TV. Take a second to join our community of story lovers. Your support keeps this world of emotions alive. But Lily changed everything. She talked constantly about Christmas with the enthusiasm of a child who'd heard about magic but never quite believed it might include her. She drew pictures of trees and presents and Santa Claus with a red suit brighter than anything in nature. She asked questions Dorothy answered with patience Vincent found remarkable. "Do you have a tree?" Lily asked him one evening, appearing in his office doorway with the fearlessness of someone who'd decided he wasn't dangerous after all. Vincent looked up from contracts that suddenly seemed less important than this small person asking impossible questions. "No," he admitted. "I don't usually celebrate Christmas." Lily's face fell with disappointment so pure it hurt to witness. "Why not?" "Because I'm alone. Because decorating for holidays that celebrate family feels like mockery when you have none. Because hope is expensive, and Christmas demands it by the truckload." "I haven't had reason to," Vincent said instead. Lily considered this with the seriousness of someone solving complex mathematics. "You do now," she announced. "We're here." The logic was irrefutable. What Vincent didn't know was that saying yes to that Christmas tree would be the beginning of forever. One decision. One tree. One moment that would seal all three of their fates. Which was how Vincent found himself at a Christmas tree lot on the edge of town 3 days later, Lily's small hand in his, her excited chatter filling the air between them like music. "That one's too skinny. That one's too short. That one—" She stopped, her eyes widening. "That one's perfect." The tree she'd chosen was massive, at least 8 feet tall, full and symmetrical in a way that suggested it had been waiting specifically for them to find it. "It's too big," Vincent said. "It's perfect," Lily insisted. They brought it home strapped to the SUV's roof, and Nina met them at the entrance with an expression that made Vincent's heart stutter. Joy mixed with disbelief, as if witnessing something she'd stopped letting herself imagine. That evening, the staff gathered to help decorate. Dorothy producing boxes of ornaments from storage Vincent didn't know existed, Teresa bringing cookies, Walt offering advice on tree placement with the authority of someone who'd done this before. Lily directed operations with 6-year-old certainty, assigning tasks and approving placement with discriminating taste. Vincent found himself holding a fragile glass ornament shaped like a star, unsure where it belonged, when Lily appeared beside him. "That one goes at the top," she said. "It's special." "Why?" "Because stars show people the way home." The simple wisdom of it struck him silent. And in that moment, Vincent Russo realized the truth he'd been running from for 3 weeks. He was already home. They were already his family. The only question was whether he'd be brave enough to admit it. He lifted her up. When had he become comfortable doing that? And together they placed the star at the tree's highest point, where it caught light and threw it back in fractured brilliance. When he set Lily down, he caught Nina's eyes across the room and saw his own wonder reflected back. 2 people discovering that maybe, just maybe, they'd found their way home without quite meaning to. The mansion transformed. Lights in windows, wreaths on doors, warmth spreading through rooms that had been cold for years. And Vincent Russo realized he wasn't preparing for Christmas. He was preparing for forever. Chapter 6. Vincent found Nina in the library long after midnight, curled in the leather chair nearest the fire, staring into flames with the kind of focus that suggested she was seeing something beyond dancing light and burning wood. "Can't sleep?" he asked from the doorway, and she startled slightly before recognizing him. "Old habit," she said, offering a small smile. "I worked night shifts so long, my body still thinks 3 a.m. is normal." He crossed to the other chair, settling into it with the weight of someone carrying exhaustion like a second skin. They sat in silence, not uncomfortable, but charged with things neither knew how to say. "Tell me about Lily's father," Vincent said finally, surprising himself with the directness. What Nina told him next would reveal the pattern they were both repeating: abandonment, loss, the fear of loving again. They were two broken people on the edge of something beautiful. But would the past destroy their future before it even began? Nina's expression closed briefly before opening again, resignation replacing whatever defense she'd started to construct. "There's not much to tell. James was—" She paused, choosing words carefully. "Charming. Exciting. Completely unsuitable for actual responsibility. When I got pregnant, he stayed just long enough to make promises he never intended to keep. Then left before Lily was born. Do you miss him?" "No." The answer came without hesitation. "I miss the fantasy version I'd created in my head. The real man. He did us a favor by leaving before he could disappoint us both." Vincent nodded, understanding more than she probably intended him to. "And you?" Nina asked, turning the question back. "Dorothy mentioned you lost your wife." The words hit like old bruises, tender but no longer shocking. "Isabella," he said, and the name felt strange after years of not speaking it aloud. "She died 5 years ago. Childbirth complications. The baby didn't survive either." Nina's sharp intake of breath was soft but audible. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be. We weren't—" Vincent stopped, trying to find honest words. "It was an arranged marriage. Respect without love. She wanted a child desperately. Needed one, really. Like it would fill something missing. The doctor said pregnancy was dangerous for her, but she insisted. And when it went wrong—" He trailed off, the memory of those final hours still sharp enough to cut. "You blame yourself," Nina said quietly. "Not a question. I should have said no, should have refused, should have protected her from her own determination. Would she have listened?" Vincent almost smiled. "No. Isabella was many things, but obedient wasn't one of them." They fell into silence again, this time weighted with shared grief. Different losses that somehow created understanding rather than distance. Vincent was about to confess something he'd never told another living soul, and once the words were spoken, there would be no taking them back. No returning to the safety of isolation. "I built walls after that," Vincent continued, surprising himself with the confession. "Convinced myself that caring about anyone was weakness, that isolation was strength, that power was enough." Was it? Nina's eyes held his, gentle but unflinching. No. The admission cost him something, but felt necessary. It was just another kind of dying. Slower, quieter, but dying nonetheless. Nina reached across the space between their chairs, her hand finding his shoulder in a touch so brief it might have been accidental, but wasn't. "Lily woke me up," she said softly. "Not just literally, though there was that, but really woke me up. Made me remember that surviving isn't the same as living." Vincent covered her hand with his before she could pull away, holding it there against his shoulder with gentle pressure. "She's waking me up too," he admitted. "Both of you are." They sat like that, connected by touch and honesty and the fire's warmth, until Nina finally stood to go to bed. Her hand trailed across his shoulder as she left. Permission, acknowledgement, promise. And Vincent sat alone in the library long after she'd gone, staring into flames and wondering if maybe he could be someone worthy of the faith they'd placed in him. Christmas Eve arrived with fresh snow falling soft instead of brutal, the kind that made the world look clean and possible rather than buried in cold. The mansion had been transformed over the past weeks by Dorothy's efficient management and Lily's infectious enthusiasm. Every room touched by holiday magic that felt both foreign and right. Dinner was intimate. Just the three of them in the smaller dining room, rather than the formal space that seated 20. Teresa had outdone herself. Roast beef with rosemary, potatoes that melted on the tongue, vegetables that even Lily ate without complaint. Vincent had hidden a ring box in his desk drawer for 3 days, rehearsing words that never felt adequate. Tonight, he would either gain everything or lose the only family he'd had in 5 years. The choice was terrifying, but staying silent was no longer an option. Afterward, they moved to the library where the massive tree stood in the corner, lights twinkling like captured stars. Presents wrapped in paper Lily had helped choose stacked beneath its branches. Vincent had bought gifts. Dorothy had handled most of the details. But he'd personally selected a few items after watching what made Lily's eyes light up during their rare trips into town. Books, art supplies, a stuffed dog she'd admired in a shop window with longing so naked it hurt. For Nina, he'd chosen something more complicated. A locket. Delicate gold. The kind of jewelry that meant something without screaming its value. Inside, he'd had them engrave simple words. Home is who you choose. But the ring box in his pocket weighed more than all the other gifts combined. He'd been carrying it for 3 days, pulling it out at random moments to stare at the simple diamond on gold, rehearsing words that sounded increasingly inadequate. Now, watching Lily color on the floor while Nina sipped tea with her legs curled beneath her, firelight painting them both in shades of warmth and safety. Vincent felt his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape. Jackson had noticed the ring box yesterday, his sharp eyes missing nothing. "You're really doing this," Jackson had said, not quite a question. "Yes." "Good." Jackson's approval had been unexpected. "You've been dead for 5 years, boss. It's about time you came back to life." Now, with Christmas Eve wrapping around them like a gift itself, Vincent stood and crossed to the desk drawer where he'd hidden the box hours ago. His hands trembled slightly as he retrieved it. Vincent Russo, who'd faced down armed rivals without flinching, undone by the prospect of kneeling before 2 people who'd somehow become everything. "Lily," he said, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "Nina, there's something I need to ask you both." This was it. The moment Vincent had been running from his entire life. The moment he would either become whole or shatter completely. There was no middle ground, only the terrifying leap into trust. They looked up, Lily with curiosity, Nina with sudden wariness that suggested she sensed something significant was coming. Vincent positioned himself between them, then lowered himself to his knees, Lily on the floor to his left, Nina on the sofa to his right. "When you knocked on my gate," he said to Lily, "you asked me to find your mother. But I think maybe you were asking me to find something else too. Something I'd buried so deep I forgot it existed." Lily watched him with wide eyes, her crayon forgotten in her hand. "You asked me to remember what it means to care about someone," Vincent continued. "To let people in. To be more than the fortress I'd built." He opened the box, revealing the ring that caught firelight and threw it back in brilliant fragments. Nina's sharp intake of breath was audible in the quiet room. "I'm not good at this," Vincent admitted, looking between them. "I've spent years being someone else, someone hard and cold and alone. But you've shown me that maybe I can be different. Maybe I can be someone worthy of trust, of love, of family." His voice cracked on the last word. "So I'm asking both of you. Will you stay? Not as guests, not as charity. As family. As mine, if you'll have me." He focused on Nina, his heart in his throat. "Will you marry me? Will you let me keep coming home to you? Will you build something here with me that none of us knew we needed until it already existed?" For a moment, silence held the room in suspended animation. Then Lily launched herself at him with a shriek of pure joy. "Yes! Yes! Say yes, Mama!" Her small arms wrapping around his neck with force that nearly knocked him backward. Vincent caught her, holding her tight while his eyes remained locked on Nina's face. Tears streamed down Nina's cheeks, her hand pressed to her mouth, and for one terrible heartbeat, Vincent thought she might refuse. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, we'll stay. We'll build this impossible thing together." Vincent's exhale shook his entire body. He stood, Lily still clinging to him, and crossed to where Nina sat. She rose to meet him, her hands reaching for his face, and when she kissed him, it tasted like salt and promise and homecoming all at once. Lily squealed with delight between them, and they broke apart laughing, three broken people discovering they could be whole together. Vincent slid the ring onto Nina's finger with hands that shook, watching as the gold caught light and claimed her as his. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate but honest. "Thank you for knocking on my gate, for teaching me that power isn't the same as strength, for showing me what it means to have something worth protecting." "Thank you for opening it," Nina replied, her forehead resting against his. "For choosing us, for being brave enough to risk your heart again." Outside, snow continued falling soft and endless. Inside, a family was born, not through blood, but through choice, through courage, through love that had grown in the spaces between survival and surrender. And Vincent Russo, who'd ruled through fear for decades, discovered that the greatest empire wasn't built on power. It was built on the people who made you want to come home. Christmas morning dawned bright and impossibly white, the world scrubbed clean by snow that had fallen through the night like benediction. Vincent woke to find Lily bouncing on the bed with energy that defied physics. "It's Christmas! Santa came! There are presents!" Her excitement so pure it made his chest ache. Nina laughed from beside him, her hair messy with sleep, the ring on her finger catching morning light through the windows. "How does she have this much energy?" Vincent groaned, but he was smiling. "You'll learn," Nina said, kissing his shoulder. "Coffee helps." They descended together, an actual family now, official in ways that went beyond paperwork, and found the staff had arrived early, their faces bright with genuine happiness. Dorothy had tears in her eyes when she pulled Vincent aside. "I'm so proud of you," she said quietly. "Your mother would be too." The words hit harder than expected, memories of a woman who died when he was barely old enough to remember her face rising up like ghosts demanding recognition. "Thank you," Vincent said, his voice thick. "For everything. For staying. For caring about this when you didn't have to." "Oh, Mr. Russo." Dorothy patted his cheek with weathered hands. "I always cared. I just didn't think you'd let me." The morning unfolded in chaos and joy, presents torn open with abandon, wrapping paper scattered like confetti, Lily's delighted shrieks echoing through halls that had been silent for too long. Vincent Russo had spent 5 years building walls to keep the world out. It took a 6-year-old girl in a blue coat less than 5 minutes to tear them all down. And what came after was better than anything he'd ever built. Vincent had Dorothy photograph everything, wanting to capture proof that this was real, that he hadn't imagined his way into a life he didn't deserve. Later, when Lily was occupied with her new toys and Nina had dozed off by the fire, exhausted by happiness and healing, Vincent stood at the window looking out at his city covered in white. Jackson appeared beside him, silent solidarity, and for a long moment they simply stood together. "She changed everything," Vincent said quietly, watching Lily play through the window's reflection. "Both of them." Jackson nodded. "That's what family does, sir. Changes everything." "I was dead for 5 years," Vincent continued, voicing something he'd only recently understood. "Walking around, conducting business, maintaining control, but dead inside. They brought me back." "You let them," Jackson corrected gently. that's the hard part, the choosing to live again. Vincent thought about that first morning. Lily at his gate, frozen and desperate, asking impossible things. How easy it would have been to send her away, to maintain the fortress, to stay safe in his isolation. How close he'd come to missing this. "I'm glad I opened the gate," he said. "So am I, sir." Jackson's rare smile appeared. "So am I." Behind them, Lily called out, "Vincent, come see!" And the sound of his name in her voice, casual and trusting and full of love, made something in his chest expand until he thought he might break from the joy of it. Nina woke, reaching for him even before her eyes fully opened, and he crossed to her, settling beside the fire with this woman who'd walked through his gates expecting nothing and given him everything. "Merry Christmas," she whispered against his shoulder. "Merry Christmas," he replied, and meant it more than he'd ever meant anything. The fortress had become a home. The crime boss had become a father. And in the space where emptiness had lived for 5 long years, family took root and grew, messy and complicated and perfect in its imperfection. Vincent Russo, who'd ruled through fear and built empires on blood, learned the truth that poets and philosophers had known for centuries. The greatest strength isn't power over others. It's allowing yourself to be loved. And in that love, discovering who you were always meant to be. If you felt something while watching, please subscribe. That's how I know these stories mean something to you, even on your TV. Take a second to join our community of story lovers. Your support keeps this world of emotions alive.